Joining me now from Toronto is Sean Ding. He's co-founder and CEO of GRisk, a research and analytics company. Sean, first of all, I just want to get your reaction right now to China's move to close the U.S. consulate in Chengdu.
Oh, thanks. First of all, thanks for having me here. I think the move from the Chinese side is reciprocal. It's something that they pretty much have to do because when it comes to diplomatic protocol, when one consulate is closed in one country, the other country sort of have to do this. So that doesn't really leave China with a lot of options in this particular move. But if you look at the way that these two countries have been sort of going back and forth at each other, I think we're definitely in for another round of downward spiral in bilateral relationship, at least until November.
And Sean, if you can, try to give us some context, especially for those who may not be that familiar with Chengdu, why it may have been chosen instead of consulates in other Chinese cities, and is it comparable at all to Houston in any way?
Well, from a protocol perspective, I think it is quite comparable. I mean, even if you look at the latitude, it's pretty much the same. And if you look at how basically Chengdu, the role of the U.S. consulate in Chengdu is primarily to cover American residents, citizens in Southwest China and Southern China. And that's the same pretty much role for the Houston consulate in the U.S. And also the other options or the other consulates, U.S. consulates in China are not really something that's on par with Houston. There were rumors about China trying to or thinking about closing the consulate in Hong Kong, but then the consul general in Hong Kong is actually an ambassador ranking official in terms of the diplomatic protocol. So it's not really an option. So I think this is actually, just from a purely protocol perspective, it's actually quite reciprocal. Although it's definitely it's a very sad fact.
And Sean, you do have some unique perspective. You worked with former U.S. President Jimmy Carter, who helped normalize relations with China 40 years ago. We've seen just so much rapid back and forth and actions between these two countries in recent weeks. How much further do you think it can go? And at what point would you say that this relationship is broken, or is that even possible?
Well, anything is a possibility these days, especially when it comes to China-U.S. relations. But I still think that a lot of the rhetoric coming from Washington, if you look at the series of speeches, Secretary Pompeo's speech, Attorney General William Barr's speech, and dating back to June, you have Robert O'Brien's speech, National Security Advisor. It's all trying to draw a clear ideological line in the U.S. And I think it's hard to argue that these speeches are not geared towards setting a stage for the November elections. In that sense, I think China, to a certain extent, is prepared for this sort of election year, China bashing election year escalation. But the key question is whether there is still a bottom line that these two countries are able to draw. There is a bit of optimistic signal coming from the U.S. side. At least Mark Esper said that he wanted to visit China by the end of the year to talk about military to military exchange and crisis management, crisis communication management. So that's at least a positive signal coming from the U.S. side that these two countries are still cognizant of a possibility of further escalation, especially from a geopolitical perspective. But in general, the atmosphere, I think, is going to worsen, at least until November. And on the commercial and trade and technology front, we don't see any real sign of easing of tension.
And adding to that, Sean, just building on what you just said there, there's no going back on the phase one U.S.-China trade deal. So in that sense, are you optimistic there?
Well, if you look at Vice Premier Liu He's speech in Shanghai back in June when he spoke to, in writing to China's top financial institutions and money managers, he said that both countries have to create a conducive sort of atmosphere and conditions for the trade one deal, for the phase one deal to be implemented. Well, I think China is still very committed to delivering the purchase targets. If you look at the agriculture purchase numbers that just came out yesterday, it's pretty evident that China is still upholding its commitment in the trade one deal, phase one deal. But no condition is permanent. If some of the sanctions that the U.S. has been toying around with do become reality, I think there is still a possibility for China to dial back some of the purchase agreements in the trade one deal, phase one deal. But I don't see the phase one deal to be entirely abandoned.